I'm going to go over all 51 unique formable modifiers added to the game in the recent update and put them in a tier list. I will be judging them based on 3 factors: how good the buffs are, how easy the formable is, and how useful they will be for the specific country after forming. For modifiers that are shared between formables, I will primarily be taking the highest score into account. This video will be split into chapters for each tier, so feel free to skip ahead. And with that being said, I'll try to breeze through each modifier to make this video as concise as possible, so without further ado, starting at the bottom of the list, at 51st place we have the Maritime Republics, which is available to Venice and Genoa. As you can see, the buffs aren't particularly helpful for either country, and even getting the forming is difficult, as other people will take the land you need almost all of the time. In 50th place, we unfortunately have the Mongol Empire. Looking at its score, we can clearly see why. It's just too hard to form and it takes too long. The server is likely to be dead by the time you're formed, so even though the buffs are good on their own, they feel more like a reward for actually being able to form the Mongol Empire. Next up is the Dutch Empire. Like the Mongols, this formable just takes too long for the buffs to be useful, and the buffs themselves aren't even really that good. Well, 20% building speed is kind of useful for developing after you formed, but even that is kind of iffy. The Confederation of Northern States suffers from the same problem as the Dutch. It takes too long to form, and the buffs aren't really worth it at the same time. And you're probably gonna hear me say this a lot for the hard formables. Not far ahead from the Dutch, we have the Belgian Empire in 47th. Its buffs are even less good than the Dutch, but it is much easier to form, which secures it a higher place. Korea in 46 only gives a 10% tax buff, which is mediocre for the south at best and even worse for the north. Its placement, however, is secured due to the fact that it is relatively easy to form. The Portuguese Empire shares many of the shortcomings of the Dutch, again being a late game formable. However, the naval buffs that it gives are pretty good, which allows it to secure 45th place. In 44th is Tonga, which despite having an amazing modifier name, gives almost no buffs, but since you basically formed this unopposed, it gets a higher place. Next up is Brazil. When I first drafted this video, I was sure this was going to be in last place, but looking at it now, it's basically impossible to lose to Uruguay. And if you do lose to Uruguay as Brazil, you should quit this game, you incompetent piece of shit. Anyway, this buff only gives you 5% extra money from democracy, which is why it's still so low on the list. Another colonial empire makes its appearance near the bottom of the list, this time being the Spanish Empire in 42nd. And yes, the same problem is present. At least the buffs are somewhat useful for it. The African Union is in 41st, and it also shares the same problem with the colonial empires, taking too long to form. However, it is slightly easier because not many people will interfere with you forming. In 40th place, we find the British Empire. As good as the buffs are, you won't make most use out of them because you only get them after the servers died most of the time. That being said, if you still do have opponents after forming the empire, then the naval attack and defense does come in handy for you. 39th place goes to the Dreams of Liberation shared by 3 Latin American formables. The buffs themselves are awfully mediocre, and its placing is only saved because Grand Colombia is pretty easy to form. The Austro-Gothic Kingdom is 38th, as it's not that hard to perform compared to some of the formables mentioned, and the buffs that it gives are decent, but only if you really plan to switch to using infantry after forming. In 37th, we have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is really a jack of all trades. It's not too hard to form, but the buffs that it gives aren't really that spectacular either. East Africa is 36th, which is super easy to form, but it only gives mediocre buffs. That being said though, this is where it proves to be better than the African Union, as you can take advantage of the buffs almost immediately, giving it a higher placement. The Macedonian Empire is 35th, and while it does give spectacular buffs to your army, it is very hard to take advantage of them because you have to fight through Turkey, Iran, and maybe even India to even form this country. The next 2 places share very similar modifiers, which both give ground defense and a massive reduction in fort cost, but as one formable is much easier than the other, the Habsburg Empires go in 34th place, while Czechoslovakia goes in 33rd. 32nd place goes to the North American Union, but only if you form it as the USA. The buffs that this formable gives are only useful if you're democratic, which Canada and Mexico are unlikely to be if they've even formed this. That being said, this modifier does give 4% more money to the richest country in the game, so I guess there's that. 31st place goes to Carthage and Phoenicia, which get similar buffs to Venice and Genoa, but unlike them, they, especially Carthage, with its large population, can make use of them more effectively. The Arab League takes 30th place. It's kind of the middle ground between the easy and hard formables, which still makes it a little hard to form, but you do get 10% defense on all units, which is really good among the other buffs. Next is the Soviet Union in 29th place. It is relatively easy to form unless China gets involved, and the buffs themselves synergize well with Russia, as communism is a good ideology for it, while the building speed helps negate the reduction that Russia has from limited conscription. Despite that, in terms of raw stats, the buffs themselves aren't particularly good. Yugoslavia is in 28th, and while it gives a massive 60% resistance, it doesn't really have the population to make use of this, leaving it quite average. The Maya Empire is next, which although only gives a mediocre buffs, it is really easy to form, which secures it 27th place. In 26th is the Italian Empire, which also gives ideology power like the Soviet Union, but instead to nationalism and fascism. For Italy, this is really useful because nationalism is an ideology that it wants to pick, especially if you're looking to form the Roman Empire. Speaking of the Romans themselves, they are in 25th place, right above the Italian Empire. Don't get me wrong, the buffs are absolutely amazing, except for the minus 30% naval starting experience. Why is that a thing? But you can't really make use of the buffs well just because most of your opponents will be defeated by the time you can even form this. 24th place goes to the Cossack formables that were recently added. Although they are hard to form in the first place, as you have to go to war with Russia, they give really nice buffs to your army, which is simply amazing for these countries. The Mughal Empire is 23rd, giving nice all-around buffs to its economy while not being too difficult to form if we're playing as Pakistan. Nothing more to say here. Above it is the Empire of Japan, which is also not hard to form and it gives decent buffs to your military. However, it would work better if Japan switches to fascism, which is unlikely, and you usually have no opponents after forming this given you've already taken out China. In 21st is the Trans-Saharan routes, shared by 3 sub-Saharan formables. They don't really give game-breaking buffs, but given how easy they are to form, you basically get them for free, which gives them a much higher score. The Republic of China takes 20th place, and its buffs are just amazing. First of all, no debuffs, and a 25% cost reduction in developing cities, which is really helpful for China with its large population. Sadly, ever since electronics got nerfed, Taiwan has become harder to play, but despite that, the buffs and its synergies are still enough to secure a decently high ranking. Ahead is the European Union in 19th place. It can be hard to form depending on your starting country, but 10% ideology power and minus 20% building cost is still extremely good. However, it has to be said that fascism would probably work better with this modifier, as it can negate the stability loss when you declare war. In 18th place we have the Holy Roman Empire. The buffs are simply amazing despite having some minor downsides. The only problem is that it can be a little hard to form the Holy Roman Empire, otherwise this would be in a much higher place. Right above it is the Russian Empire in 17th. Compared to the Soviets, I think these buffs are just more helpful to Russia, and they don't force Russia to go communist at the same time. Minus 15% justification time just helps Russia because it has a lot of countries to expand into, while the extra manpower and resistance helps it defend from China or any other threat. Overall, these are more all-round buffs for Russia, which gives it a higher place compared to the Soviets. Sharing the same score of the Russian Empire is the Wuhan dynasty. Overall, the buffs are pretty decent, especially to help yourself defend against China, and the formable is super easy. Pretty good modifier overall. In 15th we have the Cradles of Civilization, shared by 3 Middle Eastern formables. Out of them, Babylonia can utilize them the best because it is the easiest formable out of all of them, and it gives really nice buffs to research and war exhaustion early on, outranking its fellow colonial empires stuck in C and D tier. Here we see the French Empire in 14th. First of all, the buffs are just amazing overall. The only thing stopping it from getting a higher score is that it still takes a long time to form, and you're usually forming it, well, just to form it, and you'd probably leave the server after it, which leaves the buffs not as useful. And above the French, we have the Germans. The buffs are still really good, though I'm not sure the war exhaustion increase was intentional, but that does lower the score a little bit. Otherwise, even though the buffs aren't as good as the French Empire, it is still significantly easier to form this country, which allows it to share the same score as France. In 12th place, we have the Mexican Empire. The buffs themselves are decent, but what makes it have such a high place is due to how easy it is to form, and the infantry defense and resistance really helps you in defending against the USA. The Iberian Union is 11th, and for a good reason. Just like Mexico, it's not hard to form it as Spain or Portugal, and the buffs themselves are helpful for you to get more political power, to get your ideology quicker, which is just amazing in the early game. Alright, you made it to the top 10, and this spot is held by the Byzantine Empire. It can be a little hard to form depending on the server, but the buffs are absolutely amazing. Basically, every aspect of your country is buffed, And these buffs are going to be very helpful for you if you want to go further and form the European Union or the Macedonian Empire as Greece. Above the Byzantines is the Persian Empire in 9th place. Although it can be a little harder to form than the Byzantines or a little easier, it really depends on the server. The 25% building cost reduction really helps you to develop your country after you've formed, and the extra experience for your infantry is just nice in general. Next is upholding the Mandate of Heaven, which is shared by 3 Chinese formables. The buffs, although not as good as the Republic of China, are still nice, and it is much easier to form unless you're playing as Mongolia for whatever reason. But even then, it is a nice buff to help you form the Mongol Empire, because you usually go for China first. Much like the Republic of China, you get nice buffs to tax and development cost, which is especially useful for China as mentioned before. In 7th is another shared modifier, this time called the Age of the Caliphs, but only as the Almohads, which is a new formable for Morocco. The reason is that the other two just take too long for the buff to even be useful. That being said, if you do form this as the Almohads, you get really amazing buffs, especially the 10% research and ground attack that you get early on. Timurids are in 6th place, and just by looking at it, I don't have to say much about their modifier. 15% ground attack is just simply amazing. I know I've said this a lot, but a lot of these buffs are just really good. And the modifier doesn't have any debuffs either. The only downside is that it is a little hard to form, but the buffs are definitely helpful if Russia, China, or India start to attack you later in the game. Having the same score as the Timurids is the North Sea Empire in 5th place. This modifier is especially useful if you're going for the British Empire, as you can justify even faster and you get even less war exhaustion, which really helps, especially if you're trying to speedrun the formable. And if you're not, the modifier is still really solid, and it's really not that hard to form the North Sea Empire. In 4th place is the Ottoman Empire. This modifier is almost perfect. You get a massive 15% research, 15% ground attack, and 15% starting experience for all your ground units. This would have easily been put in S tier if it weren't for the fact that you get a massive 35% reduction in political power. This means you get your ideology slower, your conscription slower, and you can't get as much policies. So in practice, it's really not that nice. It barely misses out on S tier. And finally, for the top 3, coming in at 3rd place is the Napoleonic Empire. There's really nothing bad about this modifier other than the minus 20 military starting experience, which you can negate by training. This formable is also pretty easy as France, and you can form it quickly. And after you formed it, you can still use it against many enemies like the UK, Russia, or even the USA if they decide to go to war with you. Overall, the army buffs are just really good, and you can definitely make use of this well as France after forming. However, this modifier would be overshadowed in terms of raw stats by the Swedish Empire in 2nd place. I mean, just look at it. 20 ground attack and minus 30 reinforcement cost, not to mention the minus 15 ground upkeep. You just get so much buffs for your army in general. The only downside is that you do take a hit to your manpower gain, which is already pretty hard to come by as Sweden, and sometimes Russia may stop you from forming. Nevertheless, this is easily a top tier modifier and would have taken 1st place if it wasn't for the Frankish Empire. I don't even have to say anything. It keeps the 20% ground attack that Sweden has, and it could have stopped there. But no, it also gives a minus 15% development cost and justification time, which is just absolutely broken for a country in Europe. And the formable itself isn't hard either. You can do it consistently as both France and Germany. Overall, I believe that the Frankish Empire's modifier is probably the best modifier in the game. Until they add new ones, of course, who knows. So, there's all the 51 unique formable modifiers ranked from worst to best. If you put it in a tier list, it will look something like this. I also made another tier list for the formable modifiers before I decided to standardize how I would grade them. And so you can compare the tier lists and see where I've made the most changes. I'll leave the tier list in the description for you if you want to make your own, and that's really